Welcome back, everybody, to That CMMC Show. Today, I have a special guest, a friend that I've known for many years throughout the CMMC journey, Andy Geppert. It's nice for you to join us here today, Andy. Andy's got a really interesting perspective because he is in an industry that until I got into this world, I did not know had to do CMMC, nor would be such a big player in the defense space. And Andy, I'll let you do a little bit of an intro about you and the organization. And yeah, I'll let you take it from there.
Sure. Thanks, Daniel. So Andy Geppert, I work at HDR, and we're headquartered here in Omaha, Nebraska. Get to work from home today. So I got my nice kind of studio going on here. Previous to HDR, I was working over at US Stratcom, which coincidentally HDR designed the new headquarters building over there. And I was working in their joint cyber center. Previous to that, I was working for Cybercom. So about 15 years of working in government service before coming to HDR. So specifically was hired in to help address the CMMC issue here with Summit 7. So by the time that I got to HDR, we had already kind of started working with Summit 7 on building out the enclave, or at least the initial relationship. And so it was hit the ground running immediately for when we got in. HDR itself is, we're a privately owned architecture and engineering and consulting firm. Do a lot of government projects. Additionally, we do a lot of hospitals. We do a lot of prisons. We're kind of all over the place when it comes to architecture and design, but we're not just limited within that space. We also do a lot of consulting for things like land surveys. We do critical infrastructure design, power grids, things like that. And we even have some OT cyber stuff that we do within our space. So pretty diverse portfolio for HDR and also myself. So it was kind of a good fit.
That's awesome, Andy. I know when we've talked before, the AEC nomenclature, architectural engineering and construction, one of the things that people don't realize is like you guys are working with multiple federal agencies, right? Not just the DoD, but I mean, a lot of construction organizations, a lot of architectural, a lot of engineering are doing multiple different federal projects. I didn't realize this. I went and spoke at a breakfast, I guess it was end of last year, the Association of Builders and Contractors. And there were about 100 people in the room, and I'm located here in Huntsville, Alabama, where there's Redstone Arsenal right in my back door. I see a beautiful Saturn V rocket outside of my window here. And I asked them, I was like, how many of you do defense work? And like the hand just shot up, right? Because we're in the we built the second Quantico here, so forth and so on. And then I asked the question like, okay, well, how many of you know about CMMC? And I had 2 hands out of the 100 people. And it's so interesting because in the AEC space, there's so much work being done for defense and other federal agencies, but a lot of defense, especially in Guam right now, that it's kind of shocking that people haven't heard about this. But what I'm finding out, Andy, and this, we'll talk about this a little bit later in the episode, but the suppliers downstream, right? Like they're starting to now realize, oh my gosh, this is a problem that I can't run away from, right? If I want to keep being an electrician for my prime, or if I want to still be able to produce and lay concrete or whatever it might be, or even just design and engineer the documents, right? Blueprints and schematics. It's like, I've got a little bit of a problem in front of me, but let's jump right into it. Actually, it's a pretty good transition here. So
yeah,
how specifically are AEC companies impacted? And this is the question I get all the time, and you live in this world. So I'm really happy you're here. What kind of data should they be on the lookout for that would actually be considered CUI? Either they're in receipt of it or maybe they're generating it, Andy. What's been your perspective on that?
So there's a couple different perspectives to look at that. There's the CMMC centric one, which is DoD information that you get. And a lot of that's pretty straightforward, things that you would expect. Designs for buildings, designs for skiffs, things that like power grids on base. A lot of bases have their own, separate power grids. Those types of things, a lot of the time we'll get CUI that's associated with them. A lot of time it's CTI, controlled technical information, that'll come through. I haven't seen much outside of that. The thing that we've noticed quite a bit is with DoD, it's CUI top and bottom, and so everything else in between is kind of left up to interpretation. So we work a lot with our clients in order to determine what is and is not CUI, so that way we can give them the most compliant product we can with the information that we have. On the other side, the non-DoD side, it's everywhere. A lot of specified that, but didn't expect to run into, and a lot of that comes from reading contracts where electric power companies or water companies are including CEII, which is critical energy infrastructure information, which when you go to NARA's site, you go through, there's two different authorities that govern it, which is also an interesting perspective from CUI that I don't think a lot of people know, is that depending on who the authority that's governing the data that you're receiving is also going to depend on how you receive that or how you handle it. So DOE has one of the authorities, and then FERC has the other authority for CEII. So that's another area where we see it quite a bit. Department of Transportation is probably what has impacted a lot of construction companies, and they don't realize it yet. There's sensitive security information, or SSI, also another specified handling requirement that comes through, and with that, it's pretty much critical infrastructure information, anything that would put transportation at a stoppage, right? So that's what we think of when we think of critical infrastructure. And it's such a big part of our national security. I don't think a lot of people realize that. It's not just war fighting for DoD, right? And the bullets and the missiles and the planes that that supply that. It's also, for instance, the logistics routes and how things are transported from one side of the nation to the other. If you're fighting a war in Europe, you have to go all the way to the East Coast. If you're fighting a war in the Pacific, you're going all the way over to the West Coast. And supplies have to move from all over the country in order to get there. So we're seeing that type of information in contracts more and more frequently, and we're also seeing that it isn't necessarily pushed out directly from the government. It's coming from commercial sources.
Oh,
and
interesting.
So it's growing, right? It's a giant beast within our space. So we're trying to navigate it as best we can, because there's not a lot of guidance out there for how that's supposed to be handled.
Well, and that's what I found out. So we just actually got to see each other in person at our conference CS2 last week, and another construction company was actually there, and they pulled me aside and said, Daniel, like, we're doing a tunneling project for a subway in the Northeast. And I said, oh, okay, cool. They're like, did you know that the Department of Transportation actually came and knocked on our door and said, how are you protecting this data to NIST 800-171? I was like, that's the first I've heard of the Department of Transportation getting involved with putting requirements in contracts to protect it to the same level that the DoD is now requesting as part of CMMC. And so I always thought that was interesting. It's like, you go back in the history of the CMMC world, right? Executive orders, and hey, we're going to stand up NARA, which is the kind of ultimate source of truth of defining what is CUI, right? Law, regulation, government-wide policies, right? It's the big repository. And so when you kind of go through that, there's been something in the making for a really long time. And this is kind of our next conversation here, is there's something called FAR CUI. So the DoD decide to be honestly a little proactive with the protection of CUI through the DFAR 7012 clause that a lot of listeners are familiar with. And they said, hey, you gotta abide by this by the end of December 2017. And if you're not, let us know that you're not actually meeting the requirements. Well, we all know nobody did that at all. Like I've not met maybe but 2 or 3 companies that actually took that seriously, which is why CMMC has been introduced as a third-party certification requirement for certain levels, part of level 2 and level 3. But the federal government finally got their stuff together. This is after years in the making from the executive order, and have launched this thing in January in a proposed rule called the FAR CUI. Mm-hmm. So explain to me a little bit, Andy, about how that FAR CUI might impact maybe more of the business. Maybe, how are you looking at this from a general like risk perspective, right? How are you leaning into FAR CUI, and how has that impacted your CMMC journey, if at all?
I mean, so CMMC I think is less impacted right now because it is specifically a DoD. So kind of following your string, right? So you've got EO 13556, which essentially stands up the CUI program. You have 32 CFR 2002, which essentially codifies it into the government. Now, the thing about 32 CFR 2002 is there's a clause about applicability. And for applicability, it says it is applicable to executive branch entities and indirectly applicable to non-executive branch entities when entered into a contract. So for instance, with your example with the Northeast Tunnel, if the requirement wasn't included within that contract, then you also run into an issue of, okay, well, there's nothing that's actually governing my requirement to handle this CUI unless my client is included it in. So that's the first hurdle that you have to get over, right? There's been relatively no guidance on it. When you look at the history of the FAR CUI rule, I'm a big fan of the Sum It Up podcast.
Oh yeah. So shout out Jacob and Jason.
Shout out to Jacob and Jason. I was going through and I was listening to there was an episode where Jacob was reading out the annual reports from Mark Bradley up to the president, right? And in Jacob's word, you can see his descent slowly into madness as he's going through and the things. He at one point he likens the progress of the CUI FAR clause to the Jarndyces from Charles Dickens's Bleak House. And it is really funny when you think about it, especially as a this is going directly to the president, talking about how slow this FAR CUI rule is moving. He also states that not publishing the CUI FAR rule contributes, it aids and abets the non-proliferation or the proliferation of non-standard application for protection of CUI sensitive government data. So that's where we're at right now. Well,
yeah, it's like the DoD's doing this and basically no other agency. They haven't been given official guidance on how to do it, which enter what you're about to say about FAR CUI.
Yeah, FAR CUI actually, and I found this out too by digging. There's one other agency that actually has a FAR supplement.
Ooh, can I guess?
Yes.
Okay, I'm gonna guess. Trebek, what is Department of Homeland Security for 500? Hey, all right.
That's correct. Yep. So Department of Homeland Security is the only other one. So FAR CUI rule, when that came out in January for the pre-publication public comment period, we started seeing a lot of things in there that honestly, from a risk perspective, is going to be huge for industry, and not just us, but industry in general, with anybody who deals with Department of Transportation or USDA or gosh, I mean, you name it, it's all over the Department of Education. We were talking at the conference. There were some folks from one of the universities that I'll leave nameless right now, but we were talking to them, and they're saying, you would be surprised how much information in the education space is CUI, and how much that is, because you fill out a FAFSA form, and all of that data becomes CUI. Okay, well, how is that handled? Well, government's already told me that in 2002, it doesn't apply to me. So in walks FAR CUI rule, which says, okay, now every executive branch entity needs to protect it uniformly with NIST SP 800-171. They state revision 2 in the document, thankfully, because CMMC and DoD with the class deviation. But they state revision 2 with the acknowledgement that eventually they'll go to revision 3. And then they also state, I think that the biggest thing, and the thing I'm most excited for, is the fact that they're going to generate a standard form. And with that standard form,
this is
that
exciting.
is going to tell us what is CUI within our contract. And if we discover anything that we think is CUI, we are required to actually give it or report that back to the government agency.
And that is the biggest breath of fresh air, quite honestly, I think, because we built this little crosswalk that you see here on the screen about, CMMC program overlay with FAR CUI. Well, guess what? It looks the same. Now, little known fact, it's NASA, Department of Homeland Security, and DoD that are on the FAR Council drafting this. So I'm assuming DoD had quite a bit of input into what this actually looks like. But the incident response time's gotten smaller, right? 72 hours versus 8. Which, by the way, FAR CUI would trump DFARS 7012 in the sense of the more stringent requirements. And then the third-party certification. They didn't take it out. They just said at the agency's discretion, they can choose to allow the requirement for a third-party certification. But to your point, Andy, the thing not on this chart that is a game changer for anybody doing federal contracting is this SFXXXX form, right, that they're coming out with to define on the contract, similar to like a CDRL, right? Contract data requirements list, but it's a more in-depth document. So hopefully, I'm knocking on wood here, that actually calls out in somewhat level of detail what's going to be CUI as a deliverable, or what you might even be in receipt of as part of that contract, which right now it's the Wild West. We joked at the conference saying, we see emails coming through from people sitting on an Army installation that are like, hey, you want to go play golf this afternoon? This email contains controlled unclassified information. It's like, okay, like calm down a little bit, right? Captain Rogers over here. And so anyways, this form will help so much, hopefully start being able to divide out what's going to be CUI, what's going to be FCI as part of this contract. Now, to your point, and this is where it gets, we call it the spicy meatball, higher ed, right? I know we're taking a little bit of a pivot here, but just if you look at the information collected as part of any type of funding, federal funding for universities, a lot of that information for, incentives, grants, federal aid is a really, really, really big one, is now going to be CUI. When all this kind of comes to fruition, there's going to be CUI everywhere. And what I think, because right now there's the tension of enclave or not enclave, right? Like, do I segment this data? Do I not? When you start reaching into universities with that type of requirement, they're going to have to start benchmarking everything to 800-171, because to divide that data out in those systems, it just starts falling apart very quickly, right? And so it's going to be interesting to see how that progresses throughout multiple different industries, not only AEC, but higher ed and other, manufacturing, so forth and so on, because it's going to end up with a pretty large impact. And it's going to be the new cyber standard for not only federal contracts, but in my opinion, I think it'll be the largest standard for private subcontracts as well, even in lieu of federal dollars being spent, right? So, but yeah, it's kind of fascinating stuff when you start digging into it. You're like, man, this is going to be 5-10 years from now. It's going to completely transform the cyber maturity of businesses here in the US and even abroad, quite honestly.
Absolutely. You know, you look at the impact long term, and you'd mentioned, you know, that CMMC may be the standard, right? That every other government agency ends up going to, or it may be something that even in private industry that they start saying, okay, this is the gold standard. I can tell you, I review a lot of contracts, and ISO 20001, this 27001 is probably the most popular one that I see within the space, right? Everybody trusts it. It's global. It's risk based. I mean, there's a lot of good things about ISO 27001. But when you get into this proliferation of government information, you're not going to be able to get around it for CUI. So I think you're going to start seeing NIST SP 171 on a lot more contracts. You're probably going to see a lot more industries becoming aware, I would say within the next year, that they have CUI within their ecosystem and that now they need to protect it. So, I mean, it's going to be Wild West.
It's you say that, so I love story time. It's my favorite. I get to talk to so many different types of companies, and there was a construction company, large construction company, doing a lot of building in all sorts of places, and they were like, "Yeah, we think we want to do an enclave." I said, "That's great. You know, an enclave meaning that you keep the CUI in that boundary, whatever you've defined." And they're like, "Yeah, but we just don't think we have that much CUI." And I was like, "Okay, well, we've generated a list of all the CUI keywords, and there's some content searches you can do in M365." And so I sent them that document and said, "Hey, follow these steps and figure out, you know, let's figure out kind of the reach and scope of what you have." They came back with, I think it was like 570 marked documents with distribution statement C on it. And it was kind of one of the aha moments, like, because here's the thing, and you know this, IT supports the systems that will have CUI on them. They do not know if CUI exists on them or not. It is not fair to IT to be the one holding the stick, if you will. It's an organizational responsibility of defining data flow and then informing IT, hey, these are the critical systems I need to execute this work. Can you make sure that they're made compliant, right? And so to that end, specifically in the industry that you guys are in, the AEC space, there's this interesting thing with CMMC because it leans on DFAR 7012 with like FedRAMP requirements, FedRAMP moderate or moderate equivalent, obviously implementation of NIST 800-171, incident response requirements. And then you might have additional above and beyond that specified type CUI where it's US persons, potentially US citizens if you're in the nuclear space, right? So let me throw you one because this got brought up at the conference. Are there tools that you can't use in your space? Are there tools that you want to use, but you can't because they're not compliant yet? And what are some tools that you know have been able to pass the compliance check, right? Like I know Autodesk just launched a GovCloud version of their offering, right? So maybe go into a little bit of detail. What are you seeing from your day-to-day operations of your kind of boots on the ground, actually using and working with these applications?
Yeah, so Autodesk launched their GovCloud. Now, what I will say is with the GovCloud, there are things that the original Autodesk cloud environment that they have outside that area. There are things that environment has that the Autodesk GovCloud does not have. Right.
Of course. That always seems to be the narrative, right? It's like, you don't get the full cake. We'll give you a slice of it though, you know?
Yep. And so we resort to looking for a lot of on-prem applications for the things that we need to do. So for instance, as opposed to Autodesk, we might use Revit, right? And so Revit will give us a mechanism or a means in order to do the same thing. The only thing is that you have to keep it current, and so you can only go back so many iterations, right? So if the company only supports 3 or 4 iterations of the same version back, when they introduce the next version, the last one has to drop off, or you have to manage the risk. As you know, it's kind of pointed out within 171, right? So you have to manage end-of-life applications.
Yep.
With Bluebeam, that is that was mentioned specifically at the conference too. And we kind of talked about that on the side, which is they had a on-prem capability that matched their cloud capability. It was the exact same thing, except it was a desktop application.
And everybody in
And
the
so
industry was like, thank God. Everybody was like, thank God we can use Bluebeam, right? Until you introduced some bad news to me in front of all of my friends. Andy comes in with some bad news, which is actually good news. So
it was, so it went EOL in November. In November, they stopped support. It actually had been EOL for a couple of years, but they continued to support patching and updates for it. But as of November, they stopped, and so now they moved to that cloud version for it. We use Bluebeam, like for instance, Review within our environment too, but Review doesn't do the same thing that Bluebeam, the cloud application, does. Instead, what we've found is that there's a workaround. Bluebeam is very committed to doing this and to being compliant and moving into the space. And so they are working towards, okay, how can we address this? Nice. In the meantime, we're working with what we have in order to continue the same productivity and the same quality. The thing that we have to kind of do, within the AEC space is a lot of expectation management when it comes to CMMC. That some of the tools just aren't going to work with the cloud environment. There's a lot of AEC industry. We use a lot of tools that engineers, that they love using the same tools that they've used for years because they've become very adept at their applications and how they're used and what they need to do in order to make it work. Or they might have their entire catalog of specifications that are in there. And this is something I didn't know until fairly recently, is that engineers, what they do is they hoard data. So
they're like 10 years back, they're pulling back something that they did, right? It's like, oh, okay, this is applicable for today.
Exactly. Well, it's not just that. It's also like, for instance, tensile strength of specific cords or for like suspension grids or whatever. I'm not an engineer, so I can't speak to.
You could have fooled me. You rattled off all sorts of things I don't know about. So.
As long as you sound confident, people will believe you.
That's right.
So, but also things like, for instance, load-bearing weights or things that most people, they got a user manual for this thing and then they throw it in a desk drawer somewhere. These guys are cataloging them and then they integrate it into their tool, whatever they're using. And so you have things that are either not cloud compatible, meaning that they have a per license or per machine license, or machine-based license, or you have issues with, for instance, the FedRAMP cloud versions, where a lot of companies are seeing that cloud is the future, so they're trying to move to a cloud environment. But then you have this FedRAMP thing that kind of stands in their way for applicability within. And I think that's what Bluebeam may have run into. And you also see in other spaces that there are so many different licensing and support models where a application just physically, like, it just cannot work within a cloud environment. It just won't call on the license, or it doesn't have the right repositories, or a lot of things break when you bring a project from a on-prem environment into a cloud environment, that you have to reestablish those connections to, and so they don't come out of the box. You have to figure out how to make them work.
Well, and that's kind of the interesting thing, having to take something that the business has been using for years and pivot it, because we talk about it all the time. There's a tension between collaboration and compliance, right? To your point, a job that might used to take 30 minutes with the applications that are commercially available might take an hour because you have to use an on-prem version, right? Or you have to use a not as robust version of their cloud FedRAMP authorization, offering, right? And so that brings up a good question. Like, there are other things outside of tools. What are some of the past practices that you've had to adapt to meet the compliance requirements of CMMC just in general, right? So like, if we take the tools out, what are some other things that you've had to like look back maybe on your corporate security policy side and either bring those things forward into CMMC, or maybe you've used CMMC to justify updating corporate policy, right? Because it could work both ways for organizations.
So thankfully HDR is, I mean, we're a very compliance conscious organization, and so we have other requirements for physical security that end up getting brought forward and match up with what we're doing for CMMC.
Nice.
And NIST SP 800-171. We have been doing audits, third-party audits for our organization for years to the NIST SP 800-171 standard in order to make sure that we are doing what's right. And looking at, so for instance, printing is a really good example, right? Printing, I mean, you can't just do a lot of companies use cloud printers, so you can't use a cloud printer or do that. So you have to adapt. You have to say, okay, how do I get this in? I've got an on-prem printer now that has a pin pad in a secure room, and I need to go there to pull it. Or you establish a new connection with a service that will actually do that for you, which I found out that Xerox, of all companies, is one of the few printing companies that has a cloud or a federal FedRAMP compliant environment that you can
That's
use.
awesome. So a cloud hosted print server, is that Uniflow or is that somebody else? I can't remember the name.
I don't remember.
I'll have to look it up while we're talking. I'll keep going.
Yeah. So so printing was a pretty big example of that, where we had to kind of adapt very quickly because I mean, printing doesn't stop. You have to.
No, it does not.
Yeah.
Two things I hate in the world: phone systems and printers. And man, printers are a bear in the compliance space.
Oh, but I mean, now you have, so printing leads to physical CUI. Physical CUI leads to storage requirements. Storage requirement leads to physical security requirements. Leads to, now I need, locked doors, escort control. I mean, pretty much all of those things. It's funny. I mean, I grew up in the information security world as an intelligence analyst. That's what I did when I was in the Air Force. And so we worked with things like top secret and secret and all the different caveats and alphabet soups that are out there. And I'm looking at CUI, I'm like, we're handling this like classified information in a lot of ways, right? Clean desk policies is a new thing for a lot of people. Engineers will do go through and be like, no, I need that right there. I need that on my desk so I can reference it, every day while I'm coming in. And it's not compliant. You have to adjust. You have to adapt.
We were talking about this not right before Justin hit the record button on us, but one of the things that I've found out in doing this is CMMC is bringing to light a lot of export control requirements are kind of drifting up. So what I mean by that is a lot of, to your point earlier, CTI is export control, right? And so when you're dealing with some of those authorities, it's U.S. personship, U.S. data sovereignty, right, with the data. And so when you start bringing physical CUI into bear, you have a whole different level of access control, right? Now, not only do I have to vet everyone with a login to my enclave, right, if I'm using like a virtual desktop setup, I've got to now authenticate people in the building, right, that are going to have access to that room or have access to that lockbox, right, and make sure that they're U.S. persons, right? And so now that's above and beyond basic CUI handling requirements, but we're seeing export control requirements that should have been followed for a decade plus, probably at this point in time, finally being taken seriously because it happens to be attached to the majority of the CUI that they're working with, right? And so I'm seeing like CMMC is over here. Export control was kind of down here for a long time. And now export control is starting to get the attention that it needs because, I mean, when you look at it, and Scott and I, our CEO, joke about this all the time, it's like export control is where you either wear an orange jumpsuit if there's a violation or deemed export, or you're going to write a really big check, right? Because there's false claims acts. You know, those are what I would call fractional impacts compared to disclosing unauthorized export control, right? And so anyways, I just thought that was funny because we're starting to see something that should have been taken seriously that was kind of a backseat for a long time for a lot of these companies being brought forward because CUI is having those requirements as well. And so one of the biggest places we see this happening is not necessarily at the prime level, like the HDR level, for example. They've got an Andy on staff, right? Who doesn't love a good Andy on staff, right? Who can help decouple and understand how all these overlays happen. But what we're seeing, and this prompts my next question, it's a pretty strong lead on there, is supply chain. People without an Andy on staff, right? Where the primes, we're seeing this a lot, where primes are, you know, just like overmarking, similar to the DoD, right? Or they're not taking the time to decontrol or descope CUI in the sense they haven't done that historically. But we're seeing kind of two things. One, we're seeing the supply chain wake up and realize, oh my gosh, the CMMC thing's not going away. And I'm either going to have to do it or I don't get to do this business anymore, which is usually a significant portion of their revenue. Or they're trying to work with the prime to descope or decontrol so that maybe they only have FCI data now, right? Instead of CUI data. And so, Andy, kind of walk me through, you know, if you were talking to a supplier today in the AEC space, what's some recommendation that you would give to them? And what's some recommendations you would give to their prime on how to best support their supply chain?
So for the supply chain on the way down, you first is pay attention and read your contracts. Honestly, it's a huge thing. When you see 7012, 7019, or 7020, the DFARS clauses in your contract, you know, those mean something. With 7021 coming out, it's going to mean even more because the prime is essentially signing up and vouching for your compliance, right? So as a compliance centric framework, right, the prime is responsible for, okay, I've got 110, my you know, joint venture has a 110 because that's another area of this. My subcontractor has 110, and now we're having to ask very uncomfortable questions like, hey, what's your SPUR score? Which I didn't think was an issue, but that's an issue for a lot of people. Some people consider it to be proprietary, right? So now you're having to ask that. So that's the first, is read your contracts, understand what's in it and what you're agreeing to when you get into that. And that includes the flow down. So you can play 7 degrees of Kevin Bacon with a lot of things, right? You're going through and you're saying, okay, I've got it because I'm the prime. Now, you know, this electric, you know, transformer production company, now they've got it because they're a supplier. And then the person that supplies this to them in order to do that, and, you know, so on and so forth. And you go down and you say, okay, well, how far down is diluted enough to include it? And the answer is, it's all the way down.
It's all the way down. It's like, it's going to touch everybody. The question is, you know, are primes going to have the wherewithal to realize, hey, I need to pay real close attention to descope this as much as humanly possible, or my supply chain is going to go from 500 suppliers, right? You know, tier 1 all the way down to 100 or maybe 50 in some cases. Like, we're seeing what will be a dramatic consolidation, either through acquisition because the primes are freaking out because their supply chain they know can't get there, or people are just going to leave the industry. They're going to stop doing defense work, and just because they're like, we can't afford it. You know, I'm a 50-person, 25-person, 10-person, 1-person company. that's, in the AEC space. And I'm just really struggling with this. A lot of them in conversations are having a hard time even with CMMC level 1, which is really, really basic, right? And so that's kind of the interesting thing that I've seen is a lot of people haven't read their contracts for years. They've just accepted flow downs. Now, you're a small business. You're excited to get the work. I understand that. But in DFARS pages or FAR pages, you're multiple pages of a contract typically, right? And so you could very easily just sign your name on it and be like, yeah, I'll figure this stuff out later, right? The problem is, the Grim Reaper is on your doorstep because CMMC is about to be a real thing, and your prime's going to have to be ultimately responsible for your compliance if they want to keep working with you. And one of the things that a procurement officer told us is like, if we've reached out to our critical supply chain, if they haven't heard from us, they're probably not as critical as they think they are. And so what I've been telling people is, hey, you need to call your prime. You need to ask 2 things. When do you expect this from me? And if I get this, will I be considered, can I basically be roped into your critical supply chain, right? I just need to know that my ROI is going to be worth it because I might have to spend $50, $100, $200, $300,000, depending on the scope of this thing, or sometimes millions of dollars to do this. I just need to know that you're going to be there for me, right? And so have that honest conversation. I would say, Andy, like companies like HDR, they would love for a proactive supply chain, partner of theirs to come and say, here's our journey, here's where we stand today, here's our date of certification that we're shooting for. Like, I think most primes would be very open to those conversations.
And they actually are. They're very receptive to it. We, at this point in the juncture, we're trying to figure out who within our network, within our scope, are seeking certification, whether or not it's within the next year, whether or not it's right, because that's going to be a huge thing going forward. My other advice, I think, would be to other primes is that you should start inventorying your subs now, right? Make sure you know which subs are pursuing this, because if you're not looking into it, it's gonna be an issue. You're gonna get a contract, you're gonna say, okay, now it's time to go find my subs in order to do this, and you're gonna find out that nobody that you've been working with for the past 15 years has even thought about CMMC.
Yep.
And they're required to have it. Now the de-scoping, there's kind of 2 sides of this coin. People have been playing the POAM game.
Yeah. I know exactly where you're going. Keep going.
So the POAM game, I joke, is you can have a negative Spurs score, but you have a Spurs score, and you can as long as you have a POAM and you're working on it, you can still get a federal contract.
Yep.
With self-certification, even at a level 1 or level 2 self-certification, you have to have minimum 80, right? And no moderate or high impact. So that is going to, all the POAM game players that have been saying, okay, well, I got a POAM, I can do this for, well, they're going to be in a place where like, okay, well, now all this stuff has to get fixed. I've been waiting this long to do anything about it. It's going to be a real problem.
Well, and that's the, 88 out of 110 controls is the lowest you could go. But to your point, they're all 1-point controls, right? They're not 3 and 5 point. They're not the hard stuff is what I'm trying to, like, if you're waiting around to do the easy stuff, like, and you've already done the hard, that typically doesn't make sense, right? Usually people start with the easy stuff. But that's what we've seen too, is like people out there are like been POAM to death saying, yep, I'm compliant because I have a POAM, even though my Spurs score is -200 out of -203,
Right.
It's like, that doesn't fly anymore, guys. Like, and the primes, even for self-attesting, are going to have to be responsible to make sure those things are collected. And if they're wrong, and this is going to be the interesting thing, right now we see a lot of false claims acts coming out of disgruntled IT people who have been told to do things that are not appropriate or legal, honestly, in most cases. I think we're going to see a lot of supply chain managers saying the same thing, where they're documenting a score that they might know is not actually accurate. And I think that we're going to see another wave of false claims acts with supply chain managers, not just IT, once this thing goes into full effect. That's just my crystal ball. We'll see what happens. But to your point, like, there's responsibility on both parties. Report the right thing, and the prime to store and communicate the correct thing, right, on if they can use that supplier or not.
Yeah. It's a different world for those people now that CMMC is coming into effect. It
Yep.
really is. We're having to really think about how this is going to play out and think 10 steps ahead of the contract. The other thing, kind of going back to the advice thing is when you get a contract, the first thing that you need to do, if you are the PM or the project manager on a contract, and you are bidding on something that requires CMMC or requires NIST SP 800-171, you need to talk to your IT people and say, okay, do I have these things in order to complete the work and actually do what they're asking me to do? And we've been doing that quite a bit. I can't tell you how many contracts I review going through, and I'm like, okay, this has the DFARS 7012 in it, so we need to go through, and this is what we need to do, and here's how we need to handle it, and here's the FIPS 148-2 encrypted server, and here's, all that background work that happens that most, people that work at their desk, they kind of take for granted because they're like, oh, I showed up and it's on here and it's ready to work. And that just, it can't be it. You have to work hand in hand with IT to make sure that the tools you're using are the compliant ones. And that you're doing that ahead of time, because otherwise you're starting late.
Well, we've seen that where people are running into doing an enclave because of the time crunch of when CMMC is going to be available, but they're not designing the enclave to support the needs of the contracts they're expected to win. And so there's something written in the L2 scoping guidance that says for significant boundary changes, expansions of networks, mergers or acquisitions, these would be trigger points for recertification. So the last thing you want to do is build an environment that can't service the contracts. And BD and sales, again, make sure you're communicating these requirements to IT, because if not, you're going to have to go through another certification, potentially as early as a few months after you got your first one, because you're having to change up the boundary. Multiple other sites are maybe now in scope, right? I'm expanding my network from the cloud to on-prem. And so that's a really good call out, because you need to design assuming for contract awards within the next 3 years, because you don't want to have to pay for another certification. Build to that requirement of the work you're going to be doing, so you don't have to pay another 40 to 80 grand on your CMMC certification a few months into just paying it for the first time. And with that, Andy, as we kind of wrap up, my last ask of you, because you've brought a lot of golden nuggets to the table today, any closing remarks, anything that you're just like, please do this, please don't do this, maybe words of encouragement for people that feel beaten down by this new cyber regulation. I'm going to turn the mic over to you, sir.
Sure. I'd say start now. Start last year. When you can, if you want to continue doing this, or start making a business decision. That's the thing that you have to really do, is determine whether or not this is the space that you can work in now going forward, whether or not it's worth risking 3 times the value of the contract, or if it's worth risking, as we talked about, ITAR, heavy penalties, orange jumpsuits. So it's impending. It's coming. We've heard from DoD. We've heard from Katie Arrington. We now have a new DoD CIO who seems like it's still lockstep with this. And it's move now, right? Keep going. It's not impossible. These controls, they are designed to work for industry. It is expensive for sure, so make sure you set aside your budget. And honestly, make sure that you invest in someone or a team that is going to be able to help you translate and get through this, because when you see it and you see NIST SP 800-171 and you see 110 controls and you say, I've only got 110 to go to, you still have 320 assessment objectives
Hey,
waiting in the
that's
wing.
a good call out. Yeah. It's more than 110. It's 320 that validate the 110 were implemented correctly.
I had I'd always joke about this too, because it's all or nothing on those assessment
Yeah.
objectives, right?
It's either met or unmet. There is no gray, you know?
Right. And so when I went to a Catholic high school, and I had a priest that was my Catholic studies teacher, and he used to have these multiple choice tests, and it could be A, B, C, D, or A, B, A, C, A, D, or any combination. There was no all of the above or anything like that. It could be A, B, C, D, E, and you have to fill it on a Scantron test. And so you went through, if you missed one part of the question, you missed the entire question. And his reasoning was, you either know it all or you don't know anything.
It's true. Partial credit doesn't exist in the CMMC space. You either got it or you don't.
Yep.
Yeah.
So
well,
I'd say the biggest thing.
Those are some great closing remarks, Andy. I know what we're going to do is when we post this podcast, because I'm sure there's going to be 1,000 questions from other people in the industry, we're going to put your LinkedIn on the show notes so people have a way to reach out to you, maybe ask more specific questions. Andy's an incredible resource, super smart guy. HDR's a great company. They've really been able to, and I've been working with them for years. They've really put kind of the flag in the ground saying, we're doing this well. And so if you have any questions about how to execute it well, Andy's your guy to talk to in the AEC space, and just in general, not even just industry specific, but he knows the stuff, as you can tell from the podcast today. And with that, we're going to close out. Andy, thank you for being with us today, my friend. And we're going to have another podcast, I think, coming up. I think we should do one about the international cyber regulations coming out that we haven't even touched on yet, right? But let's focus on CMMC for now. I think enough people are scared about that. So thanks for joining, and everybody have a great day.